Boeing has now finally opened shop again after finishing a bitter strike lasting for about 2 months, and at a time when the company was already struggling financially. So where do they go from here? How bad did this strike hurt them, and is Boeing's future actually safe? Stay tuned. You know, back home in Sweden, we have an interesting expression that goes something like this. If you find yourself outside and it's really cold, you can always piss in your pants to warm yourself up, but it won't stay warm for very long. That's quite a blunt way of explaining what happens when you focus on short-term gains while completely ignoring the long-term effects of your actions, which is also a perfect description of what Boeing did over 15 years ago when they decided to antagonize their workers in favor of corporate profits. So let's start with some background here. A few months ago, I made a series of videos about Boeing's transformation from an engineering-led giant into the company that we see today. In those videos, I explained how they went from using the slogan "working together" back in the early 1990s to more with less in the 2000s, shifting their focus completely over to share price and shareholder value. And that was a change that really kicked off after their merger with McDonnell Douglas back in 1997. Then in 2008, Boeing's machinist unions also went out on strike. Now that wasn't their first strike, but it would turn out to be one of their longest. And while the workers' demands included the usual things like better pay and benefits, that's not what that strike was really about. You see, Boeing launched their 787 Dreamliner in 2004, a fantastic new jet focusing on modern composite materials and new systems. But there was another aspect of the 787 that Boeing wanted to change completely, and that was its design and production techniques. They really wanted this plane's development and entry to service to be even faster than that of their Boeing 777, which had entered service in June of 1995, less than 5 years after its launch in October of 1990. But in the end, that turned out to be impossible. Instead, the Boeing 787 didn't actually enter service until October of 2011, 7.5 years after its launch. But here is what's really crucial. Boeing's management had planned for the unit cost of the 787 to be lower than that of the 777, despite using new lightweight, more expensive materials and loads of completely new systems. The management at the time believed that they could achieve that by outsourcing a lot of the design and manufacturing of the aircraft, and that the threat to their jobs was what had really triggered the machinist union strike in 2008. Now that strike lasted 8 weeks, and Boeing in the end ended up making some concessions about the outsourcing, but despite that, only the tail section of the 787 ended up being made in Washington state. Now Boeing's management wasn't happy about that 2008 strike, which had cost them around $100 million per day, so what did they do? Well, a year later, Boeing CEO Jim McNerney announced that a planned second production line for the 787 would be placed on the other side of the country, in North Charleston, South Carolina, where the workforce wasn't unionized. Then, in 2013 and 2014, when Boeing and the machinists were negotiating their next contract renewal, McNerney played out his ace card. He told the workers that if they didn't accept several serious concessions, including losing their fixed company pension plan, he would move the production of their next aircraft, the Boeing 777X, away from Washington state, even though the existing 777 was already being made there. As a result of this, McNerney got exactly what he wanted. But he also planted a seed of anger and resentment among his key workers. Now, more recently, Boeing's financial troubles have meant that they've had to consolidate the 787 production to just one facility. And which one do you think that is? Yeah, the one in South Carolina. So in other words, the 787, who actually triggered that 2008 strike, is now no longer made in a unionized facility at all. Now, this wasn't just a sore point for the workers. It wasn't great news for the company either, since this has meant that their overall production capacity is also down. In fact, Boeing had to make these and other drastic cost-cutting moves because of the devastating financial effects of the 737 MAX crashes and grounding. But there is even more facts to consider around this. They also had quality and production issues with the 787, which, interestingly enough, had to do both with the outsourced production and problems at that brand new South Carolina facility. And while these production problems were some of Boeing's costliest nightmares recently, they weren't the only ones. Boeing also has had issues, both with military contracts and, of course, that high-profile headache with the Starliner spacecraft that I guess that you all saw. So, how bad are things right now after this crippling strike? Could Boeing actually fail? Well, the short answer is no. I don't think Boeing is in any immediate danger of collapsing, and that's because despite everything that's been happening, the company still seems to be able to get their hands on the funds it needs to keep operating. In mid-October, with the strike in its 5th week and with no end in sight, Emirates President Sir Tim Clark said something that many in the industry had been reluctant to say out loud. In an interview, he stated, "Unless the company is able to raise the funds through a rights issue, I see an imminent investment downgrade with Chapter 11 bankruptcy looming on the horizon." When Boeing heard that, its management didn't waste any time proving that they could raise those funds. They're now selling both bonds and new shares in a plan that could raise up to $25 billion. And on top of that, they also have a credit agreement worth $10 billion, and they're even considering another capital increase for a further $10 billion if needed. Now, this can be seen as both good and bad news. It's good because it shows that the company still has value in the market, and that makes bankruptcy less likely. But on the bad side, these actions are also pushing Boeing's debt even higher, which already at the end of last year was around $52 billion. That's a lot of debt, but do you know what's a really sad fact here? Boeing has spent around $68 billion in stock buybacks and dividends since 2010, mainly just to make its stock more attractive to investors. That money doesn't just eclipse Boeing's current debt. Also is an estimated 3 times what they would have needed to develop a brand new Boeing 737 replacement. So with that in mind, let's have a look at what Boeing had to do to get their workers to end this strike and how they will move forward from this mess. Especially considering that they soon have another big negotiation on their hands in 2026 with their engineers union. It's exactly in cases like this that I always turn to Ground News, today's sponsor and my go-to source for seeing the full story from every angle. Something you can do as well by going to ground.news/mentor now. Ground News is a platform that pulls together news from all over the world and puts it all together in one place so you can compare how different outlets are covering the same story. With this Boeing story, for example, Ground News found hundreds of headlines, plus context on each source, like a rating indicating how subjective their printed reporting is, and even who funds the source, giving you a complete, well-rounded view of the situation. But what really sets Ground News apart is how they highlight diverse viewpoints side by side. For example, a left-leaning report from France Info covered the workers' perspective, highlighting their salary increases, while the right-leaning Daily Sabah out of Turkey instead focused on the economic impact of Boeing. You have made it very clear to me that you are frustrated with the lack of context and abundance of sensationalism found in mainstream media, and Ground News is a great way of seeing beyond that. Seeing both perspectives gives a much fairer and clear view of what's really going on, and this is where Ground News really shines. So scan this QR code or go to ground.news/mentor now to get 50% off the Vantage plan that I am using for unlimited access, whether you subscribe yourself or send it as a gift. They are subscriber funded, and I really believe in what they do, so check them out. Thank you, Ground News. Now, let's get back to the story. For those who paid close attention, back in the summer of 2023, we actually got an early hint of how Boeing's negotiations with its machinist unions might go, thanks to Spirit AeroSystems, one of their biggest suppliers. In June last year, Spirit was negotiating a new 4-year contract with its own machinist union, and what happened there was pretty telling. The union leadership accepted an early offer, but their members voted it down. Then, after a relatively brief strike, Spirit agreed to offer wage increases of 23.5% over a 4-year deal, plus a signing bonus, yearly cost of living adjustments and other guaranteed bonuses. The workers finally accepted that deal and went back to work in early July, but here is where things get really interesting. Because Boeing's investors had a very specific reaction to that deal. They were not impressed, because they had been told that Boeing would speed up their recovery by getting aircraft production costs under control. And this new Spirit deal didn't seem to fit in line with that at all. Now, the reason the investors thought that that was going to be the case was because that was exactly what Boeing's CEO, Dave Calhoun, had told them at the end of 2022, which was also when he promised that they'll be making 50 737s per month by mid-2025. And remember that number, it's going to become important soon. Now, that reaction by the investors and Calhoun's projections just shows how utterly unprepared Boeing actually was for what was coming for them. Because while all of this was happening, Boeing's own IAM 751 machinist union members were preparing for this year's contract. And when I say preparing, I mean they were saving money for a strike.
Are you willing to strike to get the improvements you deserve?
A really long and bitter strike. According to Scott Hamilton in Liam News, which by the way I highly recommend you to check out, the union leaders first told their members to create their own individual strike fund as early as back in March of 2020, and many of them actually did that. Like I mentioned before, those workers were still angry about losing their pensions, being forced to do mandatory overtime, and all of those other concessions that they had been forced to make back in 2014. Now, while junior workers in the company probably couldn't save as much, most of those who had lost their pensions 10 years ago reportedly saved enough for a 3-month strike. The machinist union also set up a hardship fund to help those who might need it, and even helped some people to find temporary jobs during the strike, so Boeing shouldn't have been surprised that the strike took as long as it did. Now, there's actually a lot more to say about these 33,000 union workers and how different groups among them behaved during this strike, so I'm actually planning another video where I'll look at this story from their perspective. But it's really important to understand that Boeing's attitude since the previous strike had created so much anger that strike action during this year's negotiations probably was close to inevitable. Now, the negotiations for this year's contract actually started back in March, and they would have started even earlier if it wasn't for that MAX 9 door blowout that I've covered before. From the very beginning, the union made it clear that they wanted a deal that would make up for what they had lost during the previous decade, and that included quite a list. Here comes some of the highlights. A 40% wage increase over a 4-year contract. A commitment that the next Boeing airliner would be made in the Puget Sound region, a seat at the Boeing board, major reductions in healthcare costs, and return of their defined benefit pension. Now, what Boeing first came up with and what the union members voted on back in September the 12th fell way short of that list. Boeing offered a 25% wage increase, which would work out a bit higher when you factored in career progression and other adjustments, but that was obviously nowhere near what the union wanted. Boeing also did agree to make its next airliner in Washington State, something the union saw as vital for job security, but here is a little bit of a catch there. You see, this commitment only applied if Boeing launched that next airliner while this contract was still in force, meaning during the next 4 years. Now, if that next aircraft, which we all assume would be a 737 replacement, is to enter service around 2035 or so, well, then Boeing would surely have to launch it in these coming 4 years. But with everything else going on around this company, I wouldn't take that for granted. Anyway, there was no mention of a seat on the Boeing board, though Boeing did offer regular meetings between union and company leadership. That would be a bare minimum, if you ask me, but apparently Calhoun, Boeing's ex-CEO, had never even met John Holden, the union's chapter president. Now that sounds incredible to me, so let me know in the comments below if that's actually not accurate. And while you're down there, make sure that you hit like and subscribe. That initial offer also did include some improvements in healthcare and insurance costs, but when it came to pensions, well, they offered improvements in the workers' 401k with higher company contributions, but not the defined benefit pension plan that the workers had before 2014. Now, what's quite interesting here is that the union's leadership publicly supported this first offer. And that was probably because they knew that it wouldn't pass anyway, but they didn't want Boeing accusing them of sabotaging the offer by speaking against it. Whatever their thinking was, the end result was, well, spectacular. 94.6% of the workers voted to reject this first offer, and 96% approved the strike, which started just after midnight on that same day. After that vote, both sides initially said that they wanted to continue negotiations, but on September the 23rd, Boeing did something very curious. They suddenly went public with what they called their best and final offer, pushing it to 30% pay increase plus some other improvements in bonuses and retirement benefits. But this was a big mistake by Boeing's management. You see, they published this offer unilaterally, without the union leadership's agreement.
I think Boeing is attempting to bargain in the press, and that's not the way to resolve this strike.
The union later said that they were still evaluating that offer when Boeing went public, and that did not go down well. Even before this, the union had accused Boeing of trying to circumnavigate them by reaching out to workers directly, so the union leadership didn't even put that best and final offer up for a vote, and Boeing later withdrew it. If the negotiations weren't already broken down before that, they certainly were now. The union's leadership made it clear that their members were in it for the long haul, and yes, that pun was definitely intended. Eventually though, with the strike affecting basically the entire industry and constantly getting worse, negotiations continued with acting US Labor Secretary Julie Su as a mediator. A new offer came through with a 35% wage increase, and this time the union leadership didn't exactly endorse it. They just told their members that the offer was worthy of their consideration. 64% of the workers, about 2/3, still rejected it, which was still a decisive result, but at least Boeing was now getting closer. Finally, on October the 30th, the two sides had a face-to-face meeting that led to a decisive offer announced the next day. The wage increase finally got to 38%, but would actually compound to an average of 43.65% of the lifetime of the contract, including some other improvements as well. And this time the union leadership actually supported this deal. On Monday the 4th of November, the machinists finally voted in favor of this deal with a majority of 59%, and then they went back to work 2 days later, ending an almost 8-week-long strike. But even as Boeing now moves past this strike, its effects are definitely not over. We still don't know the total cost, but earlier estimates suggest that it could have landed around $6.5 billion. And on top of that, this strike wasn't the only thing that happened to Boeing during the last few months. In October, they announced that they plan to cut 17,000 jobs over the next few months, equating to 10% of their worldwide workforce. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't think that these job cuts and other changes that Boeing announced are only because of the strike. Boeing's new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, explained that these changes are now necessary to align with our financial reality, and honestly, a lot of people had already seen this coming. Boeing also announced that the 777X will now be delayed another year to 2026, which surprised absolutely no one, and they also will stop making the 767 freighter in 2027 due to new emissions regulations. Now, with everything happening at Boeing, it's also kind of easy to forget that they actually have a new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, like I mentioned before. And beyond the machinist contract, we've all been waiting to see what his first major move as Boeing's new leader will be. Even without this strike, this would have been a huge challenge for him, and now it looks like Ortberg believes Boeing is long overdue for some proper streamlining. While McNerney back in the day wanted Boeing's people to do more with less, Ortberg apparently instead wants them to do less and do it better. So what will that look like then? Well, to understand that, we will have to start by looking at Boeing's current structure. The company right now consists of three main departments. There's Boeing's commercial airplanes, that's the one that we usually talk about, making airliners. Then there's Boeing Defense, Space and Security, and finally Boeing Global Services. In reality, the structure is a little bit more complicated, with management, research and development and other roles being shared between those three. But there is now a broad expectation that Boeing is going to have to shed some of its activities. We just don't know exactly how yet. It is unlikely that Boeing will do a General Electric and separate these three activities, partially because Boeing's activities are more closely related, which is how they can shift resources between civil and military programs, for example. Separating those branches also wouldn't necessarily help Boeing's finances because, for example, Boeing Global Services, which handles things like aftermarket support and freighter conversions, has been the only consistently profitable part of Boeing for the past several years. So with the strike now finally over, all eyes are now on Boeing's new CEO to see what he will and can do. While launching a new aircraft is clearly the long-term goal, Boeing really needs to first re-stabilize itself properly. Remember earlier when I mentioned that in 2022 Boeing wanted to make 50 737s per month by 2025? Well, according to Scott Hamilton in Liam News, it could take 5 years before Boeing reaches that production rate, and that's still below the 52 737s per month that they were making before the MAX was grounded in 2019. Getting back to those kind of numbers will depend on solving production issues quickly and convincing the FAA and others that this is not only possible, but possible in a safe way, is going to be a challenge in itself. But maybe the most important point here is that it's no longer possible for Boeing to choose between the markets or its people. They have been actively burning bridges with their employees for decades and have also been living off the goodwill of the markets for almost as long. With the recent cash injections, the markets have shown that they still have a bit of patience left, and some of Boeing's people are now lowering their torches and pitchforks, but I think that the drama here is far from over. In any other industry, a company that had been taking these kinds of hits to its reputation would be on a sure path to reconstruction or absorption into another company. But since Boeing is one part of a worldwide duopoly, they will likely live to fight another fight. I am just happy to see that the workers are getting some of what they deserve back, and also that those newly raised funds will go to that instead of stock buybacks and bonuses. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Now, I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, well then check out these videos next. Please also consider supporting me by supporting my sponsor by using the link below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.